Hi, I'm Marc Gorelick, President and CEO of Children's Minnesota, and I'm here today with St. Paul Police Chief Todd Axtell, who's going to talk with us a little bit about the work that's going on in the St. Paul Police Department. Chief, thank you for being here today.
Dr. Gorelick, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here with you.
You know, this year in the aftermath of a number of highly publicized incidents of black people being killed by police, most notably Breonna Taylor in Kentucky, and of course right here in Minneapolis, George Floyd, there have been a lot of calls for cities across the country to really rethink their approach to policing and public safety. Can you tell us how is St. Paul thinking about public safety these days?
Yeah, thanks for that question. First of all, I'd like to start by just saying how much I appreciate the work that Children's Hospital does in St. Paul, from your nurses to doctors to administrative personnel to the custodial staff and everyone who provides such a high level of service for our community. I have fond memories of this hospital. My first granddaughter was born here at 1 pound 8 ounces.
Oh, wow.
Spent 3 months every day visiting her in this hospital.
Wow.
So I want to thank you and your entire staff for everything that you do. To your question, this has been such a challenging time in police service and law enforcement throughout the country and throughout the world, for that matter. We have been taking a very thoughtful approach, not just for the last 4 months in St. Paul, but for the last 4 years. We've been transforming, reimagining police service in St. Paul, our extensive training protocols, our annual implicit bias training that we do, crisis intervention training, de-escalation training, making sure that our officers are now responding to mental health crisis calls, partnering with a social worker with special mental health training. And we're really proud of the fact that we've been doing this for many years now. And we're not perfect. We make mistakes. We have a long way to go like any other agency. But the St. Paul Police Department really has embraced these approaches for many years. And we're really proud of that.
Well, this, of course, is not new. Back in 2014, after Michael Brown's killing in Ferguson, Missouri, President Obama pulled together a task force, and they released a set of recommendations on 21st century policing.
Yes.
I think some of what you talked about enters into that. Maybe give us a little bit more information about that 21st century policing and how the St. Paul Police Department is incorporating any of that.
Sure. We're really proud of our 21st century policing approach. As a matter of fact, I vividly remember after the 2016, the death of Philando Castile, just in the north border of our city in Falcon Heights. We had, on the heels of other controversial police-involved killings throughout the country, we had an opportunity to engage in some of these challenging conversations. I remember at the time, Mayor Coleman and myself, we were invited to the White House to meet with President Obama for a 3.5-hour meeting with other governors, police chiefs, and mayors from throughout the country. And that was a really pivotal moment in my career to really do a deep dive and have an honest conversation without the media. I remember the president sitting down, rolling up his sleeves and saying, let's have an honest conversation. So we have embraced 21st century policing in the St. Paul Police Department to the level of we have created a website, a special website in our department comparing the 6 pillars of President Obama's 21st century policing model. And the model was designed by really the greatest minds throughout the country in policing, the advocacy communities, the activist communities, civil rights leaders, to make sure that we understand throughout the country that the only true authority that we have truly is the authority granted by the community we serve. It's so important. So if you check out our website, St. Paul Police Department 21st Century Policing, you'll see how our department lines up with each of those 6 pillars. And it will direct you to our specific policies that address all of the recommendations. We're really proud of the fact that we have taken that to the next level over the last several years.
I had a chance to talk to Mayor Carter recently, and he used the analogy of a hospital to me. He said, you know, when someone comes into the hospital, only 10% of your employees are doctors. Sometimes you need a doctor, but sometimes you need a nurse or a respiratory therapist or someone else.
Right.
And I know one of the things that you all are doing in St. Paul is this community ambassador program. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, the community ambassador program started back in 2013. It was with Billy Collins from the YWCA, Deputy Mayor Paul Williams, then Police Chief Tom Smith, started a program where we had members of our community who have specific training in youth services, youth intervention, so that we can reduce the likelihood of having officers have a confrontation, a contentious moment with a group of youth at potentially a bus stop or other areas of the city. So we work very closely with the Community Ambassador Program, and I believe it's been paying dividends for how our officers get to know our youth and our community.
Yeah, that's great. So as you know, some St. Paul Police Department officers work part-time at Children's as part of our law enforcement liaison officer program. And as part-time employees with us, they go through our training, including our diversity, equity, and inclusion training. I have been asked by some of our staff, what kind of training do they get as part of their police department training? So you can describe a little bit about the DEI training that your officers get.
Yeah, so there are qualifications and thresholds you have to meet to become a police officer in Minnesota. You have the educational requirements, and then the state post police officer standards and training. You have to go through their exam process, and then you're qualified to be a police officer. You need to be hired. We take that to the next level in St. Paul, and we have our own 4-month academy, full-time academy, where we have extensive training on de-escalation, crisis intervention training, implicit bias training. And I tell our officers all the time when I meet them for the first time to raise your hand if you have implicit bias. Some will, some won't. And I said, we're all not being honest with ourselves if we're all not raising our hand, because if you are human, you have implicit bias. And we need to take it to the next level of understanding how our bias, not if our bias impacts our work, but how our bias potentially impacts the work we do as police officers who happen to be human beings. So we're very thoughtful about that. My commitment then, 4 years ago when I became chief, and it is today, is to have annual implicit bias training. This year we've taken it, we started planning this before the tragic death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, but we started planning for our EPIC training, Ethical Policing is Courageous, of 1-day training around making sure that we have, in our policy, we have the duty to intervene, but how do we actually apply the duty to intervene, to tap an officer on the shoulder who happens to be maybe losing their temper or having a moment that doesn't reflect the values of the department, to tap the officer on the shoulder, say, I've got this call, and I've got it. And then in addition to that, we are doing moral courage training, which we're just wrapping up right now for the entire department. So important to make sure that we not only possess moral courage, but have honest conversations on how do we apply that moral courage to the job that we do and our personal lives for that matter.
You mentioned the authority for the police comes from the communities that you serve. It's a great notion. I think it's fair to say that this year is a year where trust in the police on the part of those communities has been tested and strained a bit. Can you talk a little bit about what you're doing to rebuild that trust? And I'll tell you, I hear from staff and from families who come into our facility. Some of them feel more safe in the presence of a St. Paul police officer, and some, frankly, feel less safe.
Yeah.
And how can we reassure that that everybody who comes to our facilities feels that their both their physical and their emotional safety is being protected?
Sure. We have believed, and I talked about that, I've been talking about this for years, is without trust, you're nothing more than an occupying force. Trust has to be the foundation of everything that we do, and it can't be given, it has to be earned. So we have, thankfully, Mayor Carter has helped us create an entire division focusing on community engagement. Not just community engagement, but thoughtful community engagement. Having the opportunity to hire 4 members of that unit who are not police officers, who are civilians from our community, community engagement specialists. That unit is responsible for our PAL program, for our Law Enforcement Career Path Academy program, because we know with many businesses across the country, and certainly police agencies, we have struggled with hiring people reflective of the community we serve. We're trying to knock those barriers down through our Law Enforcement Career Path Academy, hiring young adults who have challenges with the finances for schooling, transportation finances, to make sure we hire them with a livable wage, allow them to take their schooling while they're working, and most importantly, to get to know the community before they ever answer their first 911 call. That's what we believe in. That's what we're going to continue to do in the St. Paul Police Department. One person at a time, we're continuing to change the culture of our department and hopefully set the gold standard for what departments should be doing throughout the country.
Well, I appreciate hearing from you about all the things that you're doing in St. Paul Police Department to rethink your approach to public safety, to reform the police, to make sure it's better serving those communities. And I appreciate all the efforts you're making, and I appreciate you taking the time to share it with us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Appreciate it.